agradecer reencontrarnos algunos después de 2 años que nos hemos ido encontrando, y este es el inicio del seminario de la Red Universitaria Española de Historia Ambiental, donde muchos de vosotros habéis estado en los eventos anteriores y otros sois bienvenidos a partir de ahora y para siempre a la red y a trabajar en Historia Ambiental, así que gracias por estar aquí. El propósito del encuentro es buscar, generar, conocer y a partir de ahí establecer mecanismos de trabajo conjunto entre todas las líneas de investigación que existen en historia ambiental en el contexto español, más algunos compañeros portugueses que participan también en el evento, ¿no? Y a partir de ahí ir generando sinergias hacia el futuro. Cuando nosotros planteamos este evento hace algún tiempo, pensamos en la posibilidad de contar con la presencia no fácil de un amigo, que es John McNeill, que es el profesor de la Universidad de Georgetown. Invitamos a John y John aceptó encantado venir a Granada, no por primera vez a Andalucía, pero sí por primera vez a Granada, creo. Así que es para nosotros un honor y un placer contar con John hoy, que va a impartir la conferencia de apertura, lo mismo que la profesora Michelle Careño compartirá la conferencia de cierre, ¿vale? Bueno, yo voy a usar 3 minutos en presentar a John, porque no hace falta presentar a John, creo que casi todos los que estamos aquí lo conocéis. Es doctor por la Universidad de Duke, ha desarrollado toda su carrera en la Universidad de Georgetown, presentó y dirigió durante un tiempo el centro de 5 hermanos International Affairs, ¿no? El centro de 5 hermanos. Hace tiempo, sí. Hace tiempo. Todos aprendimos a hacer historia ambiental aprendimos a empezar a hacer historia ambiental con un libro, Something New Under the Sun, algo nuevo bajo el sol, que fue un poco el libro que nos indicó a todos, nos planteó muchas de las preguntas sobre historia ambiental y a partir de ahí empezamos a trabajar. Y junto a eso tiene multitud de publicaciones que todos conocéis y que, bueno, es un poco reiterativo plantear, ¿no? Mosquitoes Empire, Wide-Eyed, ¿no? El libro que publicó con William McNeill, ¿no? Sobre las redes humanas, The Human Web, Something New Under the Sun, un libro que para mí también fue muy interesante en su momento y que marcó buena parte de lo que es mi vida y de algunos de los que están aquí, que es Las montañas del mundo mediterráneo, The Mountains of the Mediterranean World, que fue algo así como un punto de luz en los que estamos trabajando en ese momento sobre montañas y sobre gestión de espacios forestales, ¿vale? Y tiene una cantidad enorme de libros editados, Global Environmental History, con Alan Rowe, los volúmenes de Cambridge World History sobre producción, destrucción y conexión desde 1750. En definitiva, una enorme producción historiográfica, presidente de la Asociación de Historia, ¿no?, de América en estos momentos y por tanto un referente para lo que hemos trabajado historia ambiental siempre. Le cedo la palabra a John, reitero el agradecimiento y a partir de aquí arrancan estas 2 jornadas de trabajo que espero que sean fructíferas, interesantes y productivas, incluso divertidas, que también puede serlo para todas y todos los que estamos aquí. Así que gracias, John, cuando tú quieras.
Bueno, gracias, Antonio. Antonio me dice que puedo hablar en inglés. So I will speak in English, unfortunately. Antonio asked me to speak about environmental history as it is practiced in the United States today. So I will do that. I'll do 3 things. I'll try to explain the traditions of environmental history as practiced in the United States. I'll try to explain what I see as some of the challenges for environmental historians that the concept of the Anthropocene poses, and then I'll discuss some of the current trends in environmental history in the United States. So I will be speaking not so much about environmental history of the United States, but environmental history as historians in the United States do it. And many of them work on Latin America, China, Europe, and so forth. So, something about the traditions, beginning with the origins of self-conscious environmental history. That is, environmental history as done by historians using the term environmental history. This began in the 1970s. And it began as a result of broader currents in society, what I call here the zeitgeist. As you all know, this was a time of popular environmentalism in many parts of the world, and that affected scholarship, including historians, and gave rise to environmental history. Whether it happened first in the United States or happened first somewhere else, I don't know, but it began in the early and mid-1970s in the United States. And its early practitioners, the people who started environmental history in the United States, were agrarian historians. We call them rural historians. And predominantly agrarian historians who worked on the western part of the United States, in here. That, I think, was accidental. I don't really know why it happened that way. But as a result of that, the early environmental history in the United States had a very strong emphasis on national parks, how they were created, how they were managed, what it meant for indigenous peoples that parks were created in the West. And it also had a strong emphasis on this concept: wilderness, wild landscapes, supposedly unmanaged landscapes, which exist primarily in the United States. They exist primarily in the West. And there were debates about whether there really is something we can call wilderness. So that's the origins. This rural Western environmental history in the 1980s was joined by a new variety, a new type of environmental history that recognized that urban environments are important to study, and in particular, urban environmental history focused on air pollution, water pollution, and all of the infrastructure that goes into creating and sustaining a city. So that means, in the modern world, piped water, sanitation, electricity, other varieties of energy all of the infrastructure that is needed to deliver those things to a city. And this became a second and powerful current within environmental history as practiced in the United States. This initially in the US attracted historians of the US, writing about US cities, Pittsburgh, Chicago. But increasingly in the 1990s, environmental historians in the US began to look more and more towards the larger world. I call it here globalization of environmental historians in the 1990s. Now, it's not to say that no environmental historians in the United States before the 1990s worked on Mexico or Brazil or Japan. A very few did. But my point is that in the 1990s, more and more came to do so, particularly on Latin America. But not, however, on Spain. I can think of only, well, in the 1990s, I can't think of any environmental historians working in the United States who worked on Spain. And since that time, I can only think of two. So for whatever reason, environmental historians in the United States don't pay attention to Spain. Okay, some more traditions. At the outset, in the 1970s, environmental history in the United States, as I said, was driven by currents in the wider society. It was motivated by environmentalism. It had usually significant political content. But in the 1990s, that political content diminished very sharply. And I think it is because of what I call the professionalization of environmental history. So when American universities set up PhD programs in environmental history and began to train students specifically in environmental history, more and more of these students worked in environmental history just as they might work in political history, German history, any kind of history. And the degree to which people doing environmental history were motivated by environmental concerns declined. This is a little bit ungenerous of me, but I think there's also a component of career incentives in this decline of political commitment on the part of environmental historians in the United States. The students get a PhD, they want to get a job, and part of getting a job is not to be too obviously politically motivated, but to be more professional. So it's interesting to compare this to two other kinds of history that had strong political content and political motivations: labor history and gender history. Both of these in the United States are approximately the same age as environmental history. That is, they came into existence in the 1960s and 1970s. And they were, like environmental history, motivated by political concerns in wider society. Both of these, labor history and gender history, have, in my estimation, kept their political spirit, political content, much more so than environmental history. The people who are attracted to these two fields are still attracted to it because of their political commitments. So that's interesting, and I don't have a good explanation for it. Okay. The cultural turn. So, in the United States, in the academic world, we're often paying attention to what's going on in Paris. And what the French do, we try to do. As I was saying, in American academia, we look to Paris and we try to imitate what the French are doing. And so in the 1990s, in history, in anthropology, in literature, in philosophy, we underwent what we call the cultural turn, an emphasis on cultural studies and cultural history, and that powerfully affected environmental history as practiced in the United States. So more and more people who consider themselves environmental historians worked on cultural environmental history, and, for example, produced studies of landscape photography, or studies of natural history museums, or studies of zoological parks, that is, zoos, and so on and so on. And this remains an important part of environmental history as practiced in the United States. I don't read that kind of environmental history, but it's important. And then, as we enter the 21st century, I think the strongest trend in environmental history as practiced in the United States is this further globalization of attention. Oops. So by 2000 or 2005, fewer than half of environmental historians in the United States worked on the United States, and more than half of them worked on other parts of the world. The most interesting component of this, in my opinion, is the attention given to China, which probably has to do with the spectacular rise of China in the 21st century in terms of wealth and power, making everything to do with China more interesting. So 20 or 30 historians of China working in the United States, most of them economic historians, converted themselves into environmental historians after about 2000 or 2005. And now, in 2018, there are probably 50 environmental historians of China in the United States. But other parts of the world also attracted attention from US environmental historians, even places that prior to 2000 had almost no environmental history done by anyone. And I put Russia and the Arab world in this category. Even Russians and Arabs did not do environmental history of anywhere before 2000, and very, very few of them do it today. But US-based environmental historians, a small handful of them, have gotten interested in these parts of the world. So, aside from Spain, almost everywhere attracts attention from US environmental historians now. Okay, this is part 2, challenges of the Anthropocene. And I'll say a few words generally about this concept, the Anthropocene, before connecting it to environmental history as practiced in the United States. So, the first thing to say is that the Anthropocene has a technical and professional community built around it, a community of stratigraphers. These are geologists who pay attention to the strata in the Earth's surface. And there is an Anthropocene working group composed mainly of geologists. It does have 2 historians on it. It has one Spaniard, a stratigrapher. And this group has been in existence since 2008, and it is trying to define the Anthropocene and trying to convince the official organizations of geology that the Anthropocene is real and should be formally recognized by the profession of geology. And that group works on mainly technical issues that I will not try to explain. But one result of this is that there are many Anthropocenes, and the geologists have one set of criteria, very technical, but other people have a different idea, or several different ideas, of the Anthropocene. It's extremely interesting to me that the concept of the Anthropocene has succeeded so widely in the humanities and some social sciences. So at least in the English language, philosophers, literature scholars, theologians, anthropologists now are constantly writing and speaking about the Anthropocene. Less so in economics and political science. And historians, well, we're still making up our minds, still deciding whether the Anthropocene is a useful concept for us. But in less than 20 years, this concept of the Anthropocene has colonized a large space in the academic world, in the scientific world, in the world of research. it's been a long time, I think, since any other concept has spread so rapidly into so many different scientific fields. So I am a member of the Anthropocene Working Group, so I pay attention to the debates within geology about the Anthropocene. My expectation is that the geologists will not accept the Anthropocene as a formal unit of geological time. It's still under discussion, but I think the geologists will decide against it. But even if they do, the Anthropocene concept and term will live on because so many other scientists and scholars have adopted it. Which means that the term will never be carefully defined. It will continue to mean different things to different people. Let me try to explain one last peculiarity of the Anthropocene Working Group and the process of formalization within geology. So when geologists discuss the various units of time, the Miocene, the Pleistocene, and so forth, normally they observe something in rocks or ice, and then they decide that they need to change the geological timescale because of what they observe in the rocks. For the Anthropocene, it's the opposite. The concept that the geological timescale needs to change came first, and only second are stratigraphers looking in the rock to try to find a boundary, a marker, which will represent the beginning of the Anthropocene. So this is unique, and many geologists find it unacceptable. The other strange thing about the Anthropocene formalization process is that the working group has people on it, such as me, who are not stratigraphers. This is unprecedented, and many geologists find it unacceptable. So this is one of the reasons, because the procedures are so exceptional, one of the reasons that I think the Anthropocene will not be formalized by the geologists. So, what about environmental historians in the Anthropocene? My reading of the situation is that environmental historians working in the United States are cautiously embracing the Anthropocene concept. Part of the caution is because of some of the critiques of the Anthropocene that come particularly from anthropology. And I think the most influential of those critiques from anthropology is from Swedish anthropologists, Alf Hornborg and Andreas Malm, who argue that the Anthropocene, the word, is illegitimate because, they say, it implies that all of humankind is responsible for the changes in the Earth system. Whereas, they maintain, only a few people are really responsible, industrial capitalists. and therefore the term Anthropocene is misleading and should be abandoned. And many environmental historians in the US accept that critique, and so they're cautious about the notion of the Anthropocene. A second reason for caution is that for the geologists, the Anthropocene has to be, as they put it, synchronous. That is, it has to begin at the same time everywhere around the Earth. This is a requirement in stratigraphy for any interval of time in Earth history. But for historians, this is a strange requirement. We divide the past up into periods as well, but we do not require that every period should begin at the same time everywhere. So, for example, we easily use the term Renaissance to refer to a period, but that means something different in Italy than it does in the Netherlands. It begins earlier in Italy and later in the Netherlands. And for historians, this is acceptable. So the requirement of a synchronous Anthropocene is difficult for historians to accept. And yet, many environmental historians are happy with the term and the concept because they think that it makes their field, environmental history, more important. So if the concept of Anthropocene is accepted, and yes, the Earth is in a new period of time in Earth history, if that is true, it is environmental history that explains how it became true. So for environmental historians, there's a attraction of the concept of the Anthropocene because it makes our subfield, our subdiscipline, more important. But personally, I'm using the term and the concept Anthropocene less and less, partly because it's so imprecise, it means different things to different people, and partly because, as a member of the Anthropocene working group, working every week with stratigraphers, I find that the stratigraphers are very uninterested in causation and in consequences. These are not important things for the profession of stratigraphy, but they are important for me as an environmental historian. And so the Anthropocene that the stratigraphers want, I think, is not very useful for environmental historians such as myself. So I often use a different term, the Great Acceleration. And what this represents is, after 1950, a huge acceleration in many of the forces that drive environmental change. You can't read this, but these refer to emissions such as nitrous oxide or methane. They refer to the temperature changes, to the acidification of the ocean, to the marine fish capture, and so on and so forth. Very several categories of environmental change. And they all show a sharp upturn in the middle of the 20th century. And for me, that I now understand as the Great Acceleration, not as the Anthropocene. 10 years ago, I used the term Anthropocene for that. Now, I don't. Some people regard the Great Acceleration as a stage of the Anthropocene because for them the Anthropocene began earlier. And in a moment I'll show you some of the arguments, the debates about that. But for me, the Great Acceleration is a substitute for the term Anthropocene, which I am using less and less because of the drawbacks, because of the imprecision of the term. So, these are more illustrations of the Great Acceleration, some data compiled by an Australian named Will Steffen. These graphs are readily available on the internet. If you haven't downloaded them, you perhaps should. They're very useful and revealing. They emphasize how different the world has become since 1950. And there are two sets of these. One is driving forces behind the Great Acceleration, and the other is indicators of the Great Acceleration. So I thought I was going to show you some of the debates about the Anthropocene and when it began, but maybe I cut that out of this presentation. So if you're interested in that, ask me about it and I'll explain what I can afterwards. But let me continue with the part of this that Antonio in particular asked me to speak about, what's happening now in environmental history as practiced in the United States. So my first observation is that climate history is on the rise. This was not a major part of environmental history as practiced in the United States 20 years ago, but it is now. And more young researchers are turning to climate history. In this respect, environmental historians in the United States are following environmental historians in Europe who have had a stronger emphasis on climate history for a longer time. So, again, following the European trends, a lot of the emphasis is on the Little Ice Age, roughly 1250 to 1850. And this work concentrates on Europe and on China and on North America, by and large. In addition to Little Ice Age studies, there are a growing number of researchers focused on specific moments with climate shocks, the most interesting of which I find to be around 535, 536. In the Northern Hemisphere, a dramatic cold spell that lasted only a few years, but is recorded in several texts in China, in Byzantium, in Ireland, and also recorded in pollen cores, ice cores, and other climate proxies. As you know, there are, thanks to the work of natural scientists producing proxy evidence on climate, every month there's tremendous quantities of new data available, and that is a large part of the explanation as to why climate history is on the rise. I expect the same is going on in Spain. And maybe I'll learn a little bit more about that today and tomorrow. A second important trend, at least I think it's important, is the rise of a perspective that some people call neo-materialism. And ultimately this comes from a philosopher named Jane Bennett, who writes, this is her book, it's called Vibrant Matter. She argues that things, because of their inherent properties, have, as she puts it, political agency. And environmental historians, especially Tim LeCain, and this is his book, The Matter of History, argue that things have historical agency. It's not just humans that make human history, but it's copper and silkworms and cattle, according to Tim LeCain. And there's more influential than Tim LeCain so far is a political scientist who writes history named Timothy Mitchell, who makes the same kinds of arguments, neo-materialist arguments, for energy sources, specifically for coal and oil. And he claims that there are inherent properties in these fuels, coal and oil, that influence the probability that any society will have democratic political forms or not. Or at least he makes this argument historically. Whether he believes it applies to the future is not clear. But there are, he says, in coal, properties that improve the chances that a coal-based society would develop democratic forms of governance. And in oil, there are inherent properties that minimize the probability that an oil-producing society would develop democratic forms. So says Timothy Mitchell. Now, neo-materialism could be just a new version of environmental determinism, and maybe it will not, in the long run, become an influential trend. But I would say that in the last 3 years, this is the most interesting development in environmental history as practiced in the United States. A third trend that seems prominent to me is the rise of environmental history of war and of military organizations. This is not entirely new. Some people, not historians, paid attention to this in the 1970s as a result of the American war in Vietnam and the particular forms of environmental warfare practiced by the United States Army in Vietnam. But after that, and that work was not done by historians, it was done by ecologists. After that, environmental historians paid very little attention to war for the next 30 years, maybe 40 years. But now, for reasons that I cannot easily explain, in the last 5 or 8 years, many more environmental historians have begun to study war and military organizations. There are several new works about the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Here are 3 of them. There are 4 main ones. Interestingly, they're all written by women. And there's also lots of new work on World War I and World War II. By and large, this new emphasis on the environmental history of war applies to warfare in the industrial age, the last 150 years or so, and not earlier pre-industrial warfare. So far, I would predict that that will change, and that the environmental history of war will become a popular subject for earlier periods of time as well. So I said I can't really explain why this is happening, but it might represent a revival of the political impulse behind environmental history, which I said some time ago had diminished, had decreased since the 1970s. Maybe to some extent it's coming back with this focus on the environmental history of war. Okay, I'm nearing the end now. I'm going to mention 4 more trends, but I'll mention them only briefly. I think these 4 are less prominent than the 3 I mentioned already. The environmental history of war, the turn to climate, and the neo-materialism. So, studies of resilience. Environmental historians are often accused of being very depressing. And in English, we use this word declensionism to describe environmental history that's always about things getting worse, things declining. It's a complaint against environmental history that it is so declensionist. I think partly as a result of this, we're getting more studies of resilience, of societies able to adjust to environmental shocks or climate shocks. And so stories that are less declensionist and more cheerful, more encouraging. I also think that environmental historians in the United States are trying to make themselves relevant to sustainability studies, because in our universities, sustainability studies is on the rise. If you want to be part of that, then you want to do environmental history that is not declensionist, but is about resilience and sustainability. Urban environmental history, which I've already said something about, is going more international. So the first generation of urban environmental history was about cities in the US. The first generation of environmental history, urban environmental history, as practiced in the US, was about cities in the US. And that's much less true now. So we have, in the US, scholars working on Mexico City, on Beijing, on Calcutta, etc., etc. Another trend that is worth mentioning is the increasing frequency with which environmental historians are working in groups together with natural scientists on climate, on pollution history, on many different topics. And here too, I think the trend I'm observing in the United States is well established in European scientific circles, including in Spain. At least that's what I think. You can tell me if I'm wrong. And lastly, another current trend, animal history. More and more people seem to be writing about big, charismatic animals. The people are not writing about mice or houseflies, but more about horses and wolves, and in one case, British dogs. That's my colleague Edmund Russell, who's done extremely interesting work on British dogs. And now, some things that are not happening in environmental history as practiced in the United States. Any discussion of the current trends should also consider the non-trends, as I call them here. So, for example, social metabolism studies. It's big in Spain, big in Vienna, not big in the United States. We have almost nobody who takes a social metabolism approach to environmental history. And we have almost nobody doing seriously quantitative environmental history. It remains more of a humanistic discipline, despite the increasing collaborations with natural scientists. And this now is very peculiar to the US context. I'll need to explain this a little bit. So in the United States, the history of the United States strongly emphasizes what I'm calling here the Holy Trinity, race, class, and gender. And almost every subject that American historians do about the United States recognizes these categories, not just as social categories, but as units of analysis for historical work. That's the norm. But in environmental history, it is not the norm. Environmental historians in the United States are much less interested in race, much less interested in gender, and dramatically less interested in class as units of analysis than are other historians in the United States. That's interesting. And again, I don't have a great explanation for it. So, with that, I am done. I've left, by my watch, about 25 minutes for debate and discussion. And I thank you for your patience and apologize once again for speaking in English. Thank you.
Thank you for your intervention. I really enjoy your presentation, and my question is obvious, particularly in this meeting, by the title of the meeting. That is, what do you think about the concept of Capitaloceno? Capitalocene, that is a derivation of Anthropocene, of course. So, well.
Okay. So, what do I think of the Capitalocene? I don't use this term either. I don't, as I said, I use Anthropocene less and less, and I don't use Capitalocene at all. Why? For me, capitalism is at least 500 years old, maybe even older. The radical disruption of the Earth system, for me, is 75 years old, approximately. And I'm persuaded by all these, all the data in all these graphs of the Great Acceleration, also by this, the carbon dioxide history of the atmosphere. But these graphs is what I refer to. This is what is convincing to me. It makes me think that the real radical departure in environmental history is the middle of the 20th century. And the term Capitalocene, for me, is not appropriate for that. If capitalism is 500 years old and the radical disruption is 75 years old, it's not a good fit. So I don't use the term. Jason Moore loves the term. As far as I know, he invented the term, although maybe I'm wrong about that. And if one took a different view about the radical disruption of the Earth system, and if one thought that was 500 years old, then the term and the concept Capitalocene would be more appropriate. But for me, it's a mismatch. It doesn't fit properly.
My question is about, I'm sorry about, I didn't came for the first time of your talk, but I'm wondering about the relationship between extraction and Anthropocene.
The relationship between extraction and the Anthropocene.
And specifically about the ideas of David Harvey.
The ideas of
David Harvey.
David Harvey.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I cannot speak helpfully about the ideas of David Harvey. I apologize for that. It's my own deficiency. Because I have barely read the ideas of David Harvey. He writes in English that's difficult. So
we read in Spanish, not in English.
Well, maybe it's easier in Spanish. I don't know.
I think so.
But he's too difficult to read. I get very impatient with authors who are difficult to read. So I've hardly read any David Harvey. But putting that aside, the relationship between extraction and the Anthropocene. So if one uses the Anthropocene to mean what I'm calling the Great Acceleration, the great disruption in the Earth system of the last 75 years or so, if that is one's concept of the Anthropocene, then extraction is central to it, because fossil fuels are central to it. Fossil fuels are the most important driving force behind all of this. And that is extraction in the sense of extraction from the earth. If one means extraction in a more social sense from communities and people around the world, well, the same is essentially true, because the extraction from the earth of coal and oil and natural gas, not everywhere, but in many places, is also a social extraction. It comes at the expense of communities in the Niger Delta, in Ecuador, in, let us say, the Gulf of Mexico. If one takes a view that the Anthropocene is older than 75 years, and there are arguments that say the Anthropocene began around 1800, began in 1610, began in 1492, has nothing to do with Granada, but everything to do with Colón. And arguments that the Anthropocene began 2,000 years ago, arguments that the Anthropocene began 7,000 years ago, and even older. There are Paleo-Anthropocene arguments that make the Anthropocene even older than the Holocene. That's the geological term for the last 11,700 years. So there are all these different ideas of the Anthropocene. If you adopt those ideas, then I think extraction is less important. Extraction in the geophysical sense, extracting things from the earth, and in the social sense, extracting things from specific communities and populations. Less important if the Anthropocene is understood to begin with the beginnings of agriculture, or with the Columbian Exchange after 1492. But even these older Anthropocenes have a component of extraction to them. It's not as big a component as for this, the young Anthropocene. In my vocabulary, the Great Acceleration.
Thank you very much. Could you explain a little bit about the relationship between the history of environmental justice in the United States? Because North Americans also say that the environmental justice movement, both the movement and the academy, started in the United States, more or less in the same years, in the 70s. What's the relationship between the two of them? Environmental history and environmental justice, academics and the movement.
Okay, so Americans may say that environmental justice and environmental history began at the same time and began in the United States. I would say only this much, that within the United States, the environmental justice movement and self-conscious environmental history began at approximately the same time. But I wouldn't necessarily say that either of these began in the United States. That's a different contention, and I'd say the probability is that it's wrong. But I don't know for sure. The relationship within the United States between the environmental justice movement and environmental history is strong in one sense and weak in another sense. It is strong in that they both come from the same origin, which is popular environmentalism. But it's weak in the sense that the direct links between the two are marginal, by which I mean the proportion of environmental historians who are consciously interested in environmental justice might be 10%. And the proportion of people who are interested in environmental justice, either as a movement or as an intellectual tool, the proportion of those people who are interested in history might be 1%. They're very present-oriented. They're very concerned about the political moment this week. And rarely are they interested in the longer-term evolution of processes that created the injustices that they focus on. So a common origin, but not much overlap.
I have one question. Before you said that one of the reasons why you're not so much interested in, or you're leaving the concept of Anthropocene, is because the geologists are not so much interested in the deep causes or the consequences, and those really interest you. So I find something like a contradiction with the question before about Capitalocene, because of course the great acceleration started in the 50s, but the causes of it more or less started 2-3 centuries before. So that is one question about the consequences, the causes of the great acceleration, dealing with your opinion that you said before about Capitalocene. That is one. And the other one is about the consequences of the great acceleration, and what do you think about this more or less common trend that is being now about the history of the future? More, I think, in the French intellectual area, that they are speaking a lot of the history of the future. And of course, this history has a great deal with the great acceleration, because it always focuses on the collapse and the inevitable, lo inevitable that it is.
Yeah, not so inevitable, in my opinion. Okay, so the first point, the contradiction that you see between my position about the Capitalocene and my interest in the causes of everything. So as a historian, I am always interested in the causes of things and in the consequences of things. The causes of the Great Acceleration, yes, they begin before the 1950s. Most of them, in my view, begin only with the adoption of fossil fuels, which I would date to approximately 1800 or 1840, to industrialism. So if the Capitalocene were the industrial Capitalocene, I might be happier with using it. Or if my concept of capitalism did not extend back to the 15th and 16th century, I might be happier with it. I may still be guilty of a contradiction, but that's how I try to resolve the contradiction. Now, the history of the future. I sometimes participate in this because people ask me to write things about how the future is going to unfold. And once or twice I have done so. But I'm extremely skeptical of what I can say about the history of the future, or what anybody can say about the history of the future. And that is simply because of that very little is inevitable, and the probability that something important and improbable will happen is great. Though we don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. Nobody knows what it is. But almost every trend, if projected out into the future, is not going to follow its trend. Something that we do not foresee is going to change it. This is probably less true for demography and macro demography, that is, trends of world population. We could predict these with reasonable confidence for 10 years or 20 years. We cannot do so for 50 years or 80 years. Something we do not foresee is going to intervene. And I think for most, if not all, of the big driving forces, we cannot see far enough into the future with any confidence to make exercises, intellectual exercises of the history of the future valuable as a guide to the future. It can still be interesting intellectual exercises because they make us think about what trends will continue, what trends are unlikely to continue, and thinking about this may be useful, but we cannot trust any of the histories of the future. Certainly not the ones that I've written. Pablo. Oh.
Hello. Thank you very much, John, for your wonderful paper. And also thank you for coming to the University of Granada. I wanted to ask you about something related with the environmental history discipline. And well, actually it would be two questions. First, it would be how much really weights environmental history in American academy? I mean, if it's a really important field, like for instance, American history, gender history, or even German history. And the second thing is that if environmental history, not only for the one written in the United States, but also of the rest of the world, has the capacity of influencing other historical narratives, historical fields that are written in other fields for the history of other countries, or for instance, we have wonderful examples of how, for instance, labor history could be connected with gender history. But sometimes I got the impression that in the case of environmental history, this is not so easily, or it's not happening so much, at least in the case of Spain. I would like to know your opinion.
Okay, so two questions, but ultimately they are both about the importance of environmental history. So within the US academic landscape, environmental history for 40 years has been growing more and more significant in quantitative terms. It's still small. So the American Society for Environmental History has about 1,000 members. They're not all in the United States. Probably 900 are in the United States. The American Historical Association has 14,000 members. So if you use those two figures, you could say that roughly 7% of historians in the United States call themselves environmental historians. That would be a bit of an exaggeration, because some of the members of the American Society for Environmental History are geographers, or maybe a few of them environmental scientists. So 7% is too much. I would say 5% is about accurate. But growing, still growing. That's more than historians of Japan. It's probably less than historians of Germany, far less than historians of Latin America, and of course, far, far less than historians of the United States in general. But it's still growing. Every year there's between 5 and 15 academic positions in environmental history. Not a lot, given the size of academia in the United States, but it's still, I would say, encouraging. Now, intellectually, what about the importance of environmental history? How does it influence history in general? This, too, I think is, from my point of view, encouraging. And I see two respects in which this is true. First of all, the number of established historians who are adopting environmental history at the midpoint of their career, or even late in their career. That is, they find it intellectually useful and powerful, and they change themselves into environmental historians. There are dozens of these. So many of the most senior and established people in the discipline of history in the United States are deciding that environmental history is worth doing. So that's one respect. A second respect is the textbooks and the synthetic books, whether they are about German history, European history, Chinese history, global history, these books that are written for students to help them learn a subject, they all include a piece of environmental history now. And 20 years ago, 0. So that's a big change. And more students are being exposed to environmental history without studying environmental history, just by studying American history or European history or global history. So I would say in the United States, environmental history is slowly colonizing the intellectual landscape and the professional landscape. I'm very happy about that.
I'm sorry to disrupt with the question of Miguel Angel, but I wonder if could we address this kind of theory of great acceleration by continents, or because I am not sure that if we analyze these graphics, considering regarding, for example, Africa or Asia, should be the same. I mean, maybe in terms of largest dams or urban population, but about international tourism, I am not sure it could be the same period of acceleration. Maybe we should do address these studies by continent or by regional areas, because it could make larger the acceleration, and maybe we can find some kinds of the opposite in Europe or maybe in North America of deceleration, decreasing. Yeah. So. Yeah, synchrony in time and synchrony in space, because now when I arrived to the Indian Ocean and I went to Thailand, in Thailand, in Laos maybe, I started some research and I realized that they are following the same thing that I studied from Spain about the dictatorship, but like some decades after the European acceleration. And I know that you have the opportunity to teach in China, and what kind of differences we can find if we introduce the the variables regarding regional areas or time and space in Africa and Asia, even in South America.
Okay. So, yeah, these are global figures. And Stefan has produced some that are disaggregated, but I couldn't find them on the web, so they're not in my presentation. But the critique of the Anthropocene concept from anthropology that I mentioned, Hornborg and Malm in particular, and the skills and perspectives of historians are essential to disaggregating these. Now, the stratigraphers and the Earth system scientists do not easily disaggregate. For them, the Earth is a unit of analysis. And for their purposes, that's fine. But once you introduce social variables, the Earth as a unit of analysis has some utility, but it, as you're suggesting, it hides a great deal. So it's essential for historians and anthropologists to intervene in these discussions, particularly when things such as causes and consequences are being discussed, to emphasize the differences from place to place, society to society. And these curves, all of them, would look significantly different if you put side by side the curve for Canada and Cameroon. And so that's where environmental historians and anthropologists can, I think, provide a useful additional alternative perspective that the stratigraphers and Earth system scientists do not easily come to. And some of them reject it. Some of the people that I work with in the Anthropocene Working Group, the stratigraphers, Earth system scientists say, yes, of course, things are different in Canada and Cameroon, but that doesn't matter because we're interested in intervals of geological time that affect the entire planet. And so differences in the schedule on which things occur, differences in the extent to which things occur in Canada and Cameroon are irrelevant. And if the only concern is the stratigraphic Anthropocene, oh, okay. But if you understand the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene to mean something larger with social components, then you have to disaggregate these figures. It's okay to have them and to think about them and to use them, but it's not okay only to think about them and use them. That's the way it appears to me. Santiago.
Yes, thank you for attending the meeting and thanks for being here today. Many thanks for the presentation. And one question I'm curious about. You've been familiar with the research on environmental history about Spain, done in Spain since the 90s, 2000s, and also from the US. And you were, I think, in some of the first meetings of the environmental history networks in Huesca.
In Huesca.
Yes. So, what is, before the presentations of today and maybe tomorrow, if you can attend, what is the non-research? What are the things that you have been missing to hear about from Spain from the environmental history perspective in the last years? Or, in other words, what are also the interests maybe that some environmental historians working in the US about Spain have now?
Okay, I can answer the second part of that. The first part of it, what are Spanish environmental historians not doing? I apologize, but I can't tell you. I haven't been following enough the work of colleagues here in Spain. So I'm not going to answer that question. I can answer the question about what the very few environmental historians in the United States who work on Spain are doing. So the first of these would be Sarah Hamilton. And she works on Valencia, on wetlands and nature conservation. It's a 20th century project. She has yet to produce her book, but she did a PhD on this and has produced some articles. And I expect there will be a book soon. That's number one. Number two is John Wing. And he has worked on Spanish forest history. And in particular used documentation concerning naval shipbuilding. And this is 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. So if I remember correctly, most of it concerns forests in Cantabria and maybe elsewhere in the north, maybe including Catalonia. I'm not sure. But I think most of the naval shipbuilding was in the north in those centuries. And that's what John Wing wrote about. I hope that there's a younger generation of students working on Spanish topics in the United States, but I don't know. I haven't seen any. None of my students want to work on Spain. They don't know enough to appreciate how wonderful it is to be in Spain. They want to work on Russia.
Maybe in the future there are a lot of Spanish working there. Because I get contact by Ana Fernandez, who is working at Columbia University about modernity and social imaginary.
Is she a student, a PhD student?
PhD or even
Okay.
doctor, I don't know.
Okay. I expect she's a PhD student. If she were already postdoctoral, I expect I would know about her.
She told me that she did her PhD in the US and he is still like.
Good. So there's at least one. Three. Okay, good.
No sé si hay alguna pregunta más, alguna última, Juan Diego. ¿Vale?
First, congratulations for your presentation. It's very comprehensive and very clear, and it's very difficult. My question is simple. Why are not trends in the American environmental history social metabolism studies?
Why are social metabolism studies so rare and underdeveloped in US environmental history? So the only person I know of who does this kind of work in the United States, and he only does it occasionally, is Jeff Kunfer. Sometimes he works with the Vienna group. And they generate data and interpret it concerning the what we call the Great Plains, the interior part of the United States. That's what Jeff Kunfer works on. There may be others. I don't think there are any others, because I think I would know. But when we have presentations at the American Society for Environmental History that are social metabolism, it is either Spaniards or Austrians who are doing this. Why should that be? As I say, I don't have a good explanation. The best I can do is the following, that in the United States, environmental history remains primarily a humanistic subdiscipline. People who are trained to analyze texts, and not a quantitative subdiscipline. And most of us are not very good with numbers. And for the social metabolism approach, without numbers, well, you can only go so far in it. It's all the more curious to me and difficult to explain because one of the pioneers of social metabolism studies, not historical ones, was an American who worked in France. Robert Ayers was his name. And he helped develop some of the concepts of quantitative social metabolism. And he was American, even though he didn't work in America. So I'm struggling to answer your question. When I go to the annual meeting of the American Society for Environmental History, and I go attend a panel that is a social metabolism panel, there might be 6 people there. I sometimes feel I'm the only person who is interested. It doesn't make sense. So I don't have a proper explanation. I have to think about this more, because there must be a reason. But I don't have it.
Pues gracias, muchas gracias, John. Gracias a todos. Y ahora hacemos un pequeño descanso, nos tomamos un café y volvemos a las 12, como está previsto en el programa, si os parece. ¿Vale? Gracias.